Radical hospitality shaped Atlantic Canadian queer resistance and resilience during the AIDS crisis. Welcome back to Here Queer and Maple Syrup, a look at queer Canadian history, an extension of my TikTok series. I'm Jacob, your host. Let's explore the AIDS crisis in Canada together. Kitchens have always been more than just a place to cook food in Atlantic Canada. Part of our culture is kitchen parties, deep discussions, and more happening in the place where our appetites are sustained. But during the AIDS crisis, they took on roles that were as radical as they were familiar. They became hospices, pharmacies, and war rooms. Grassroots activism in the Atlantic provinces shaped themselves inside kitchens. For AIDS patients, hospitals were cold, isolating places. Kitchens were warm and welcoming by contrast. When people outside of Atlantic Canada think of our kitchen parties, they think of major social events. They think of cozy, postcard-esque images, or the stereotypical yet accurate phrase from the musical Come From Away, "The door's always open and the kettle's always on." There are ideas of what Atlantic Canadian hospitality is, and they're not wrong. But unlike that image, it's so much more to us than just quaint and quirky. Especially at a time when queer folks were isolated. Kitchens were an active counteraction of that. They were even more radical than that. We have a saying here, radical hospitality, and that's precisely what happened during the AIDS crisis, especially considering the vast majority of funding for the crisis went to Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton, and Calgary. That led to an inevitable evolution of what radical hospitality looks like. Because when there is little money to help people here compared to other major centers of the country, you have no choice but to become radicalized and to take radicalized actions. Particularly after the highly public firing of Eric Smith over his HIV status in 1987, AIDS activists would share strategies around kitchen tables about how to identify which doctors, hospitals, pharmacists, and other medical professionals were safe and willing to help someone with HIV and AIDS, as well as which of them were not safe. The friendly, or at the very least non-discriminatory medical professionals were added to what was called the pink list. It was a form of counterintelligence that was developed in kitchens, a means of keeping people safe in a time when some doctors would report people to the authorities because of provincial legislation mandating the sharing of names of anyone with HIV and AIDS. This particular practice began in Nova Scotia in 1983, 2 years before the rest of the country passed similar legislation. The list was an informal document and included Dr. Bob Frederickson, who was a safe doctor, who would provide affirming care while also turning a blind eye when it came to reporting. Beyond the creation of the Pink List, kitchen tables were also the birthplace of the Nova Scotia AIDS Coalition and other organizations before they had official places to meet. Imagine little old church ladies sitting around a living room having a cuppa and some biscuits. Well, here in Atlantic Canada, it's not just little old church ladies. This happens with casual catch-ups, but also serious meetings when there is nowhere else to meet, and the stakes are quite literally life and death. AIDS patients, their caregivers, friends, and even allies of the community would sit around the kitchen table in the same fashion and plan protests, letter writing campaigns. They would coordinate with other AIDS organizations across the country. They would coordinate across distances so others outside of Halifax received support as well. Since hospitals, doctors' offices, and clinics were places of surveillance, kitchens became pharmacies and clinics where people could receive treatment without fear of being reported. They even found ways to dispense life-saving medications without fear. One of these methods was when someone with AIDS passed away, any of their remaining medication would be given to someone who needed it. AZT, for example, was upwards of $10,000 American a year in the 1980s and 90s. That's not counting for the inflation of the decades since. People who needed that medication to survive and couldn't afford it relied on these kitchen pharmacies. Now, while there was medication being brought in via these means, these kitchen pharmacies were mainly guerrilla resource sharing. By the 1990s, there were more and more treatments beyond AZT, the one everyone knows because of the 1996 musical Rent. AIDS Action Now formed the Treatment Information Exchange Network, or the TIE network, where participating doctors would prescribe the new drugs to their patients, and they would report back to the network about its effects. By using this network, AIDS Action Now was able to provide up-to-date lists for doctors and patients on which drugs were effective and which were not. When people couldn't go to hospitals out of fear of being reported, this network saved lives because it meant that the information was at people's fingertips. And when they went to a Pink List doctor, they already had the information about the medications without even friendly doctors accidentally flagging their diagnosis. These clandestine pharmacies saved so many people by providing a space that spared them from being surveilled by the authorities. It's so important to understand that this era in queer history everywhere, not just in Atlantic Canada or even just in Canada. Queer safe spaces were frequently being raided as a result of government surveillance. The gay purges were still very much in full swing until 1992. The queer community as a whole, but particularly those who worked for the government, had to be very careful because it could cost them their job. For others, when queer safe spaces were raided, innocent people would be arrested and charged just for being queer. Between 1968 and 2004, there were 38 documented police raids in Canada on queer safe spaces. These fears were very real. This was abundantly clear during Operation Soap, the bathhouse raids in Toronto in 1981, when over 300 queer men were arrested and charged under the Bawdy House laws, which are archaic laws that essentially equate bathhouses where people engage in consensual activities with brothels through the policing of morality. To this day, it remains the largest mass queer arrest in Canadian history. And the only headline appearing in Nova Scotia following Operation Soap was from about 2 weeks later, when one of the arrested claimed the government was intercepting his mail. While Toronto was still reeling from the after effects of Operation Soap, Atlantic Kitchens were subtly and unknowingly preparing for their own raid. The slow, systemic intrusion of public health surveillance. Surveillance of the queer community was not paranoia. It was the stark reality of the time. With the number of people dying of AIDS and the isolation that so many people experienced in hospitals because of misconceptions on how it spread, home or home-like hospices were the answer. While other parts of the country had the Dr. Peter Center and Casey House, Atlantic Canada didn't have that. So homes became those places where people with AIDS were treated with dignity and humanity at the end of their life. And when lots of people faced disownment from their families because of social stigma, the door's always open and the kettle's always on took on a whole new meaning, especially when walking into a home where someone has just been baking cookies or making a delicious meal. Smells so much better than walking into a hospital filled with the smell of antiseptic and that medical smell that you can't quite pinpoint what it is, but you just know that you're in a hospital. Because of this estrangement, chosen families became key in the lives of those living with AIDS, and allowing them into chosen family homes gave a lot of people a sense of relief and peace when the rest of the world felt against them. Chosen family members stepped in as caregivers and respite care when people's own families turned against them. It's again that recurring theme that comes up no matter what part of the AIDS crisis you research. People created moments of joy and hope because everything seemed intent on snuffing out those candles. In 1988, the Nova Scotia Persons with AIDS Coalition was founded, formed by those who were actually living with HIV and AIDS. The coalition was formed specifically for political action, and that same year, they went and protested in Toronto at the Canadian Conference on AIDS. They fought so hard for AIDS funding. When speaking to politicians about getting funding, they would leverage the fact that they were more moderate against the more radical approaches of groups like AIDS Action Now to get a seat at the table. For those unaware, AIDS Action Now was a Toronto-based group that was viewed as very radical due to their protest methods, which included die-ins and the infamous coffin protest, which I talk about in episode 3. It was the coalition that brought Atlantic Canada from the small kitchen tables to the big table at the federal level. What was interesting during this whole fight was that there was the tainted blood tragedy the country faced, not due to the queer community like some would have said at the time and even today in some cases, but it was actually due to improper screening of the blood. Janet Connors, the wife of a man who received tainted blood, fought alongside the Nova Scotia Persons with AIDS Coalition. She got the government to apologize for the whole thing. It truly showed how putting a straight woman at the front and demonstrating to politicians the effects on straight folks got them to change their tune much quicker than when queer folks spent so long trying to get the same results. Unfortunately, despite the advances made from Janet Connors' work, Canadian Blood Services put an overall ban on sexually active queer men, or, quote, men who have sex with men, from donating. In 2013, the overall ban was reduced to 5 years. Then it was reduced in 2016 to 1 year, and in 2019 to 6 months. As of 2022, the rule is based on sexual behavior rather than sexual orientation. A ban that took 40 years to reverse. The legislation echoed through the decades following the AIDS crisis, showing just how deeply it was rooted in queerphobia. Even though we talk about the AIDS crisis in very broad strokes in Atlantic Canada, it looked very differently for Indigenous folks who have continuously been faced with acts of genocide and white supremacy, which we will discuss in the next episode. Until next time.